In 1944, Corporal Ruben took shrapnel through his leg during a tank battle in France. His commander told him to fall back. Rivers refused, climbed into his Sherman tank, and fought for 3 more days until a direct hit killed him. Rivers served in the 761st Tank Battalion, one of the most decorated units of the Second World War, but it took 53 years for him to receive the Medal of Honor. His story is the pattern. For over a century, Black American soldiers carried 2 fights, one against the enemy overseas, one against the country they called home. To understand how deep this contradiction runs, you have to go all the way back to the Civil War and the muddy beaches of Morris Island, South Carolina. In July of 1863, the men of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry charged the walls of Fort Wagner, a Confederate stronghold guarding the approach to Charleston Harbor. The 54th was one of the first black regiments in the Union Army, and the assault on Fort Wagner was designed, at least in part, to prove that black soldiers could fight. They knew the odds going in. The fort was heavily fortified, protected by a deep moat and thick sand walls. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, the white officer who led the regiment, understood the casualties would be severe. He volunteered the 54th to lead the charge anyway, because he believed in what their sacrifice would represent. The 54th stormed the beach under artillery fire, scaled the walls, and fought hand-to-hand inside the fort before being driven back. Shaw was killed on the parapet. Nearly half the regiment was killed, wounded, or captured. The fort did not fall that night. But the 54th Massachusetts accomplished something the Union Army had been reluctant to believe was possible. They proved, in blood, that black soldiers would fight with the same courage as any other troops on the field. By the end of the Civil War, roughly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army and another 20,000 in the Navy. They fought in over 400 engagements. 16 of them earned the Medal of Honor. The reward for that service was complicated. Black soldiers were paid less than white soldiers for most of the war. The men of the 54th famously refused their pay entirely rather than accept the lower wage, serving for free until Congress equalized the rates in 1864. After the war, the promises of Reconstruction crumbled within a decade, and the veterans who had fought to end slavery watched as new systems of oppression rose to take its place. Some of those veterans went west. The regiments that became known as the Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, and the 24th and 25th Infantry served on the American frontier in the decades after the Civil War. The name, given to them by Native Americans, carried a respect that was rarely matched by the Army itself. Buffalo Soldiers guarded settlers, built roads, mapped terrain, and fought in the Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, and the conflicts in the Philippines. They earned over 20 medals of honor in the frontier period alone. One of them, Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz of the 9th Cavalry, became the first black regular Army soldier to earn the Medal of Honor after the Civil War for his actions fighting Apaches in Texas in 1870. Another, Corporal Isaiah Mays of the 24th Infantry, earned his for defending a paymaster's wagon against a bandit ambush in the Arizona Territory while severely wounded. But their valor did not translate into equality. They were stationed at the worst posts in the harshest terrain, given the oldest equipment, and commanded almost exclusively by white officers. When the 25th Infantry was stationed in Brownsville, Texas, in 1906, a nighttime shooting incident in the town led to the dishonorable discharge of 167 black soldiers, the entire battalion, without trial or evidence. President Theodore Roosevelt signed the order personally. It took until 1972 for the Army to reverse the discharges. By then, only one of the soldiers was still alive. The country was willing to use black soldiers. It was far less willing to treat them as citizens once the fighting stopped. That contradiction exploded into full view during the First World War. When America entered the conflict in 1917, black men volunteered and were drafted in large numbers. Over 380,000 black Americans served during the war. The vast majority were assigned to labor battalions, digging trenches, building roads, and unloading ships. The Army did not trust them in combat. The 369th Infantry Regiment was different. Made up of black soldiers from New York, many of them from Harlem, the 369th was shipped to France, but the American Expeditionary Forces refused to integrate them into white divisions. So the Army loaned them to the French instead. The French put them on the front line immediately. The 369th spent 191 consecutive days in combat, longer than any other American unit in the war. They never gave up a foot of ground. They never had a man captured. The French called them the Harlem Hellfighters. One of their soldiers, Private Henry Johnson, became one of the war's most celebrated heroes. On the night of May 15th, 1918, Johnson and a fellow soldier named Needham Roberts were on sentry duty in the Argonne Forest when a German raiding party of roughly 24 soldiers attacked their position. Roberts was badly wounded early in the fight. Johnson, despite being shot and slashed multiple times, fought the Germans off single-handedly with his rifle, his bolo knife, and his bare hands. He killed at least 4 and wounded many more. The raiding party retreated. France awarded Henry Johnson the Croix de Guerre, their highest military honor. The 369th Infantry Regiment received a collective Croix de Guerre as well. When the unit returned to New York, they marched up Fifth Avenue in a victory parade through Harlem that drew hundreds of thousands of people to the streets. The American Army awarded Henry Johnson nothing. The years passed, then the decades, and Johnson never received a single commendation from his own country. He struggled with his wounds, fell into poverty, and died in 1929 at the age of 32. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but it took until 2015, nearly a century after his one-man stand in the Argonne, for the United States to award Henry Johnson the Medal of Honor. The Hellfighters' homecoming parade in February 1919 was a proud day, but the summer that followed it was one of the bloodiest in American history. The period known as the Red Summer saw racial violence erupt in more than 25 American cities. In Washington, D.C., white mobs roamed black neighborhoods for 4 days in July, beating anyone they found on the streets. In Chicago, a 17-year-old black boy named Eugene Williams drifted into the white side of a segregated beach on Lake Michigan and was stoned by white bathers until he drowned. The riots that followed killed 38 people and left over 1,000 black families homeless. In Elaine, Arkansas, black sharecroppers who tried to organize a union were massacred by white posses and federal troops. The death toll was never confirmed, but estimates range from dozens to over 200. Black veterans were targeted specifically throughout this violence. The sight of black men in military uniforms, men who had proven their courage on European battlefields, was treated as a provocation. In some towns, veterans were beaten or lynched while still wearing their service uniforms. The NAACP magazine, The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, published an editorial that spring telling returning soldiers to come home fighting, not against their countrymen, but for the democracy they had been promised. The message was clear from both sides. Fighting for America overseas did not earn you the right to walk freely through America's streets. Despite all of this, when the Second World War came, black Americans answered the call again. Over 1 million black men and women served during the war in every branch of the military. They served in a segregated military, housed in separate barracks, trained at separate facilities, and led almost entirely by white officers. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in the country, launched what became known as the Double V campaign in 1942. The idea was simple but radical: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. The Double V symbol appeared on buttons, posters, and lapels across Black America. It was a declaration that winning the war was not enough. The war had to mean something at home, too. The Tuskegee Airmen became the most visible embodiment of that double fight. The 332nd Fighter Group, trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, was an all-black unit of fighter pilots who flew combat missions over North Africa, Sicily, and mainland Europe. They flew more than 15,000 individual sorties. They destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft. Their signature red painted tail fins earned them the nickname the Red Tails, and bomber crews specifically requested their escort because of their reputation for staying with the formation. The claim that the Tuskegee Airmen never lost a bomber they escorted to enemy fighters has been debated by historians, and the full record is more complicated than the legend, but the core truth remains. These pilots performed at the highest level under conditions designed to make them fail, and they earned over 150 distinguished flying crosses in the process. The skies over Europe had their heroes, but the ground war produced a story just as remarkable and just as deliberately buried. Meanwhile, on the ground in Europe, the 761st Tank Battalion was writing its own chapter. General George Patton requested the 761st for his Third Army, though his motivations were pragmatic rather than progressive. He needed tanks, and the battalion was available. When the unit arrived, Patton addressed them directly and told them that he did not care what color they were, as long as they killed Germans. The battalion fought for 183 continuous days across France, Belgium, and Germany. They participated in the Battle of the Bulge, one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, the man from the opening of this story, was one of many in the battalion who performed extraordinary acts of courage that went unrecognized for decades. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, American troops poured into New York Harbor and marched through ticker tape parades across the country. And for white veterans, the GI Bill became the greatest wealth-building program in American history. It paid for college tuition, provided low-interest home loans, and offered unemployment benefits to ease the transition to civilian life. Historians credit the GI Bill with creating the modern American middle class. For Black veterans, the GI Bill was often a promise written in invisible ink. The benefits were administered by local Veterans Administration offices and local banks, which meant they were subject to the same Jim Crow laws and redlining practices that governed everything else in the post-war South and much of the North. A Black veteran would walk into a bank in Birmingham or Jackson, paperwork in hand, and be told his home loan application was denied. The state universities that white veterans were flooding into on federal tuition money either refused Black applicants outright or claimed they had no available seats. And the job training programs that were supposed to ease the transition to civilian life steered Black veterans toward janitorial and service work, regardless of their qualifications. A study by historian Ira Katznelson found that in Mississippi in 1947, only 2 of the more than 3,200 VA-backed home, business, and farm loans went to Black veterans. 2 out of 3,200. Across the South, the pattern was similar. In New York and other northern cities, redlining practices steered Black veterans away from suburban developments like Levittown, where brand new homes were selling for prices that VA loans were specifically designed to cover. White veterans bought homes in those suburbs, built equity, and passed wealth to their children and grandchildren. Black veterans were locked out of that same opportunity, and the economic ripple of that exclusion lasted for generations. Economists have traced a direct line From the racially unequal distribution of GI Bill benefits to the persistent wealth gap between black and white families that exists to this day. If you are learning something from this video, consider subscribing. We cover stories like this every week, the kind of history that shapes everything but rarely gets told in full. Now, the next chapter in this story takes us to Korea. When the Korean War began in 1950, the American military was still technically segregated, even though President Harry Truman had signed Executive Order 9981 2 years earlier, ordering the desegregation of the armed forces. The reality on the ground moved slower than the ink on the order. Some units in Korea fought as segregated all-black regiments. Others were among the first integrated combat units in American military history. The 24th Infantry Regiment, an all-black unit with roots going back to the Buffalo Soldiers, fought in some of the war's early battles. The regiment's performance became the subject of heated debate, with some commanders praising their courage and others blaming them for setbacks that had more to do with poor leadership and impossible conditions than the color of anyone's skin. The 24th was eventually disbanded in 1951, and its soldiers were reassigned to integrated units. That disbandment marked the practical end of officially segregated combat in the American military. Black soldiers fought at Chosin Reservoir, at Incheon, and along the 38th parallel. Their performance in mixed units helped dismantle the old arguments about black soldiers being unfit for combat alongside whites. Korea became the bridge between the segregated military of the past and the integrated military that would fight in Vietnam. But integration in the ranks did not mean equality in practice. Black soldiers in Korea still faced discrimination in promotions, assignments, and military justice. They were more likely to receive harsh disciplinary action and less likely to be recommended for commendation. The war was a step forward, but a halting, grudging one. Vietnam deepened every wound that had come before it. In the early years of American involvement, black soldiers made up roughly 11% of the U.S. population, but accounted for over 20% of combat casualties. They were disproportionately assigned to infantry units and sent to the front lines. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara's Project 100,000, which lowered military entrance standards to increase troop numbers, pulled heavily from poor black communities, sending young men into combat who might otherwise never have been drafted. The racial dynamics inside the military mirrored what was happening at home. At bases in Vietnam and across the Pacific, black soldiers faced discrimination in everything from promotions to military justice. A black Marine was far more likely to be court-martialed than a white Marine for the same offense. Confederate flags flew from barracks and vehicles. In some units, racial slurs were as common as mosquitoes in the Mekong Delta. The experience of fighting in Vietnam was different from earlier wars in one crucial respect. Black soldiers in Vietnam were more politically aware, more connected to the civil rights movement happening back home, and more openly angry about the contradiction of their service. And that anger found its breaking point on a single night in April, when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. Racial tensions on military bases erupted. There were confrontations at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, on Navy aircraft carriers, and at bases across Vietnam itself. Some black soldiers wore Black Power bracelets, gave the raised fist salute, and openly questioned why they were fighting a war in Southeast Asia while their communities burned at home. Coming home from Vietnam was brutal for all veterans. The anti-war movement made returning soldiers targets of public hostility. For black veterans, the homecoming was doubly bitter. They returned to neighborhoods ravaged by poverty and the crack epidemic that was just beginning to take hold. The Veterans Affairs system was often indifferent or openly hostile to their needs. Studies later showed that Black Vietnam veterans suffered higher rates of post-traumatic stress and were less likely to receive treatment for it, a country that had no room for them whether they fought or refused to fight. The long delay in recognizing black military heroism is one of the quieter cruelties of this story. Henry Johnson waited 97 years for his Medal of Honor. The 7 Black World War II soldiers who finally received the Medal of Honor in 1997, after a review ordered by Congress, had been overlooked for over 5 decades. The Montford Point Marines, the first black men to serve in the United States Marine Corps, were not collectively recognized with the Congressional Gold Medal until 2012, nearly 70 years after they trained in segregated conditions at a camp in North Carolina. In almost every case, the delay was not because the acts of courage were in doubt. It was because the system that recorded, recommended, and approved such honors was the same system that practiced segregation. Valor does not translate across a color line drawn by the people holding the medals. The connection between the battlefield and the civil rights movement runs deeper than most history books acknowledge. The discipline, organization, and courage that black veterans carried home from these wars became direct fuel for the struggle. Medgar Evers served in the Army during World War II, fighting in the Normandy campaign before becoming field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi. Hosea Williams landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day, was severely wounded and survived, and then spent decades marching for voting rights alongside Martin Luther King Jr. Amzie Moore served in the Pacific Theater, came home to the Mississippi Delta, and began organizing voter registration drives that would eventually help bring about the Freedom Summer of 1964. Robert F. Williams, a Marine veteran, organized armed self-defense groups in Monroe, North Carolina, when the Ku Klux Klan threatened black neighborhoods. The Deacons for Defense and Justice, many of them veterans, provided armed protection for civil rights workers in Louisiana and Mississippi during the most dangerous years of the movement. These men, and thousands of others like them, applied the training they received in the military to the fight for justice at home. The discipline of holding a position under fire, the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than yourself, the intimate knowledge of what American hypocrisy actually looked like from the inside, all of it carried over from the battlefield to the march route. The civil rights movement was not only a moral awakening, it was, in many ways, a second deployment. The black veterans of these wars carried a burden that is difficult to fully comprehend from the outside. They loved a country that would not love them back, at least not equally and not consistently. They fought for principles of freedom and democracy that their own government refused to extend to them. They came home, took off the uniform, and discovered that the respect they had earned on the battlefield vanished the moment they stepped onto American soil. Each generation hoped the next one would have it easier. The men of the 54th Massachusetts hoped the Civil War would end the question of black citizenship for good. The Harlem Hellfighters believed their service in France would open doors at home. The Tuskegee Airmen and the men of the 761st believed the double V was within reach. The veterans of Korea and Vietnam believed integration would lead to genuine equality. Each generation made progress, and each generation discovered that progress came slower and cost more than anyone should have been asked to pay. What these veterans deserve from us goes beyond a belated medal or a moment of silence at a parade, though the medals matter. What they deserve is that we know their names, understand the fullness of what they endured, and refuse to let the story be simplified into something comfortable. Because the truth of it is not comfortable. It is the story of people who chose courage when the country gave them every reason to choose bitterness. And that choice, repeated across every generation, across every war, is one of the most extraordinary things in the entire American story. If this video stayed with you, the one on screen right now goes deeper into a related chapter. Click it.